Johnny Cash testified for the man everyone said he should abandon.
The phone call came at 2:47 in the morning. Johnny Cash answered on the second ring because by 1969, late-night calls weren't unusual. Somebody was always in trouble. Somebody always needed bail money or a lawyer or just someone who'd answer the phone. But this call was different. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer Johnny had never met, calling about a man Johnny barely knew, asking for something that would cost Johnny more than money. "Mr. Cash, I need you to testify tomorrow morning. Character witness. The man's about to lose everything, and your word might be the only thing that stops it." Johnny asked who the man was. When the lawyer said the name, Johnny went quiet for a long time. Because this wasn't just about helping someone in trouble. This was about standing publicly beside someone the entire country had already decided was guilty. If you're here for stories about conscience that cost something real, subscribe. We don't do easy narratives here. His name was Glen Sherley. In 1969, most people had never heard of him. The ones who had knew him as inmate number A59795 at Vacaville Prison in California. Glen was serving time for armed robbery, 5 to life. He'd made choices that put him on the wrong side of the law, and by his own admission, he'd hurt people along the way. Not physically, Glen wasn't violent, but he'd stolen, he'd lied, he'd done what desperate men do when addiction and bad decisions compound into disaster. While in prison, Glen wrote songs, good songs, raw, honest songs about guilt and consequences and the weight of knowing you destroyed your own life and couldn't undo it. One of those songs was called Greystone Chapel. It was about the prison chapel at Folsom, about finding something like redemption in a place designed for punishment, about the gap between who you were and who you wished you'd been. Glen got that song to Johnny Cash through a prison chaplain, just handed it over with a note that said, "If you ever perform at Folsom again, maybe you could play this." Johnny did more than play it. When he performed at Folsom Prison in January 1968, the concert that became the legendary At Folsom Prison album, Johnny opened with Greystone Chapel. He told the inmates Glen Sherley wrote it. He made sure Glen's name was on the album credits. That album changed Johnny's career, revitalized it, reminded the world that Johnny Cash at his best was dangerous, honest, and unwilling to sanitize reality for comfortable audiences. It also changed Glen Sherley's life. Glen got paroled in 1969, partly because of the attention the song brought, partly because he genuinely tried to change. Johnny helped him get released, gave him a job as a road crew member, brought him on tour. For a few months, it looked like a redemption story. Former inmate turns his life around, gets a second chance, makes good. Then Glen made a mistake. Not a crime, not anything illegal, but a mistake that violated parole conditions. He traveled across state lines without permission to visit family, got into an argument with his parole officer about check-in requirements, missed an appointment because he was working Johnny's tour schedule. Technical violations, the kind of thing that wouldn't mean much for someone not on parole. But for Glen Sherley, it meant going back to prison. His parole officer recommended revocation, said Glen hadn't demonstrated he could function in society without supervision, said the original sentence should be reinstated. Glen's lawyer called Johnny at 2:47 in the morning because the revocation hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., and character witnesses had to appear in person, and Johnny Cash's testimony might be the only thing that could convince a judge to give Glen another chance. But here's what made this complicated. Public opinion had already turned against Glen. The media loved the story when Glen first got paroled. Ex-con songwriter gets discovered by Johnny Cash, gets released from prison, gets a second chance. Perfect human interest angle. Then Glen struggled publicly. He missed a recording session, showed up late to sound checks, got into an argument with another crew member that witnesses described as volatile. None of it was criminal, but it fit a narrative people were ready to believe, that men like Glen Sherley don't really change, that giving them opportunities just gives them chances to prove they're who everyone thought they were all along. Country music journalists started writing pieces questioning Johnny's judgment. Conservative commentators who'd always been suspicious of Johnny's prison advocacy used Glen as evidence that rehabilitation was naive fantasy. "Johnny Cash's pet project falls apart," one headline read. "When do we stop pretending criminals deserve second chances?" Glen's parole officer cited some of these articles in his revocation recommendation. Evidence, he said, that Glen Sherley wasn't adapting to freedom responsibly. So when Johnny's phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, he wasn't just being asked to vouch for Glen. He was being asked to publicly defend someone the media had already written off, to tie his own reputation even more tightly to someone who'd become a symbol of failed rehabilitation. June was awake by then, listening to Johnny's side of the conversation. When he hung up, she asked the question he'd been asking himself. "Are you going to do it?" Johnny sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about Glen Sherley, thinking about how easy it would be to say he had a recording session, a prior commitment, anything that would let him stay out of it, thinking about what it meant that his testimony might matter not because of what he knew about Glen, but because of who Johnny Cash was, because a judge might listen to a celebrity in a way he wouldn't listen to Glen's family or employer or anyone else who'd actually witnessed Glen's day-to-day effort. "Yeah," Johnny said finally, "I'm going to do it." "Even though it'll hurt you?" "Especially because it'll hurt me. Because if I won't stand up when it costs something, then what was all that prison stuff about? Performance?" If you've ever had to decide whether to defend someone everyone else had given up on, leave a comment. What did you choose?
The revocation hearing was in a small courtroom in Ventura County, not the kind of place used to celebrity witnesses. When Johnny Cash walked in at 8:45 a.m., the room went silent. The judge looked up from his paperwork. The parole officer's expression tightened. Glen Sherley, sitting at the defendant's table, looked like he wanted to disappear. Johnny took his seat in the witness section. A few reporters had gotten wind of his appearance and clustered in the back row, notebooks ready. The hearing proceeded formally. The parole officer laid out his case. Glen Sherley had violated conditions, demonstrated unreliability, showed patterns consistent with his pre-incarceration behavior. Glen's lawyer countered: technical violations only, full employment record, genuine effort to rebuild his life under extraordinary circumstances. Then Johnny Cash was called to testify. He was sworn in, asked to state his relationship to Glen Sherley. "I'm his employer," Johnny said, "and his friend." The parole officer's lawyer went first, asked questions designed to undermine credibility. Had Johnny witnessed all of Glen's activities? Could he account for Glen's whereabouts at all times? Was Johnny aware Glen had missed check-ins with his parole officer? Johnny answered carefully, honestly. No, he couldn't account for every moment. Yes, he knew about the missed appointments. Yes, Glen had struggled with the transition. "So you're aware Mr. Sherley hasn't fully complied with his parole conditions?" "I'm aware he's been trying to hold down a job that requires travel while meeting parole requirements that assume he'd be working locally. I'm aware those two things don't fit together easily." But he knew the conditions when he accepted employment with you. He took the only job offer he had. What was he supposed to do? Stay unemployed to make parole supervision more convenient? The lawyer didn't like that answer. Tried a different angle. "Mr. Cash, you've been quite public about your support for prison reform and rehabilitation. Isn't it possible your judgment regarding Mr. Sherley is clouded by your desire to prove these ideas work?" Johnny looked at the lawyer for a long moment. "My judgment about Glen Sherley is based on watching him show up every day and work.
watching him stay sober when he could have fallen back into old patterns, watching him try harder than most people I know to do right when doing right doesn't come naturally to him anymore. He turned slightly to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, I've hired a lot of people over the years. Some of them work out, some don't. Glen works hard. He's honest. He makes mistakes, but he owns them. And the mistakes he's made, missing appointments, traveling without permission, those aren't crimes. Those are a man trying to build a life while being held to standards that make building that life nearly impossible." The parole officer leaned forward. "Mr. Cash, with respect, you're not familiar with Mr. Sherley's criminal history, the violence. Glen wasn't violent. His crimes were theft. He had an incident in prison 10 years ago, and he did his time for it. Are we talking about who he was then or who he is now? If what Johnny did matters to you, if you think showing up for people costs more than showing up for causes, hit subscribe." The judge asked a few questions of his own, asked Johnny if he believed Glen would continue working responsibly if parole continued. "Yes, I do." "And if he violates conditions again?" "Then you can revoke his parole. But right now you're revoking it for trying to work, for trying to have a relationship with his family, for technical violations that wouldn't matter if he wasn't on parole." The judge made his ruling 30 minutes later. Parole would continue with modified conditions. Glen could travel for work with advance approval. Check-ins would be adjusted to accommodate his employment schedule. It wasn't a pardon, it wasn't vindication. It was just a judge deciding that maybe the system could bend slightly to accommodate reality. Glen walked out of that courtroom with Johnny beside him. Reporters clustered immediately, asking questions Johnny mostly deflected. One asked, "Do you think this proves rehabilitation works?" Johnny stopped. "I think this proves that if we make the requirements for success impossible, then we're not really offering second chances, we're just creating more complicated ways to fail." The media coverage wasn't kind. Some outlets praised Johnny for standing by Glen. Others accused him of using his celebrity to subvert justice, of enabling criminal behavior, of being naive about the realities of recidivism. Conservative commentators had a field day. Johnny Cash more interested in criminals than victims. Glen kept working, kept trying. The arrangement lasted another year before Glen decided touring wasn't for him, that the visibility and pressure were too much, that he needed something quieter. He left Johnny's employment on good terms, worked construction jobs, stayed out of trouble. Johnny didn't publicize any of it, didn't use Glen as proof of concept for rehabilitation, didn't write songs about redemption that mentioned Glen by name. He just quietly helped when Glen needed help, stayed in touch periodically, and otherwise let Glen live his life without being a symbol for anything. Because that's what standing beside someone really looks like, not making them a cause, not turning their struggle into your narrative, just being present when it matters and stepping back when it doesn't. If this story hit you differently than you expected, if you understand that defending people is messier than defending ideas, drop a like and comment with this: "Have you ever stood beside someone everyone else had written off? What did it cost you?"
This wasn't just about a court hearing or a parole violation or a character witness testimony. It was about the distance between saying you believe in second chances and actually standing beside someone when their second chance looks like it's failing. It was about understanding that redemption doesn't follow clean narratives, that people struggle publicly and messily, and that helping them means accepting association with that mess. Johnny Cash walked into that courtroom knowing it would damage his reputation with people who wanted rehabilitation to look inspirational and clean. He testified anyway. Not because Glen Sherley was innocent, not because the system was entirely wrong,
but because someone had to stand beside Glen when it wasn't convenient or symbolic or easy. Someone had to say, "I see you trying," and that matters more than perfect compliance with rules designed for a different situation. Thanks for watching. If this story matters to you, subscribe. Share it with someone who understands that the hardest stands aren't against institutions, they're beside individuals everyone else has given up on. And remember, second chances only work if we're willing to witness the struggle without demanding perfection.